Compare these two scenes. One of them is stop motion, and the other is entirely CG. What's interesting about these movies that you're seeing is that the stop motion scene looks more like CGI than the movie that's made in CGI. Stop motion has progressed a lot over the past century, and in this episode, I'm going to explain the lengths that stop motion has gone to quote-unquote cheat and make their animations look just a little bit smoother. To help us is Andy from Andymations, who's worked on many stop motion movies, and also Sarah, who's worked on both CG and stop motion movies. Let's start with the biggest problem that faced stop motion in the early days: film cameras.
With film, the biggest problem we had back in the day was that there was no way to see what the film was seeing. So you have to put a camera next to the film camera. So you have this parallax issue where you're not animating exactly what the camera sees. And no matter how good you are, it's never exactly the same.
There were some tools to help, like the lunchbox, but even then you couldn't see the final image. It wasn't until the program Dragonframe came out that animators could see what the final image might look like. This gets even worse when you realize that if an animator messes up, they can't go back and fix any of their mistakes.
In CG, you have the luxury of being able to go back and tweak things. And so there's a lot more like freedom and flexibility, I think, to really perfect the performance that you're going for. And stop motion, it's straight ahead. And, you know, if you make a mistake, you just kind of, you have to just cut back, delete the, past 10 frames or whatever you're trying to fix and just like do it over again.
CG at the time also had its issues with characters that dipped into the uncanny valley and computers that were just generally slow. Animators in 1995's Toy Story had to wait hours for a single frame to render. But even with those issues, it was generally more forgiving to work on CG rather than stop motion. Often stop motion animators had to go to great lengths to achieve the effects that would have been simpler to do with CG, like the ability to have smears and squash and stretch for characters. Squash and stretch is what makes a character feel alive. When you punch someone, you expect the face to squish and then stretch, but in stop motion, you didn't have this. Animators had to work with the limitations of the characters they had, and the characters they had couldn't squash and stretch like a traditionally animated character might. We'll talk about squash and stretch a little more in a second. First, let's come back to smears. Smears are used in the place of motion blur. The best example of this is Roadrunner. Because he's running so fast, our eyes expect a blur. So, animators gave him multiple body parts, and sometimes body parts that stretched. Smears are pretty common in traditional animation, and even CG animation. But for stop motion, it's something that's more difficult to do. What they did in stop motion, especially in the early days, was to move the object right as they were taking a picture, so they can get a real in-camera blur. This comes with some issues, since it's easier to accidentally move a character incorrectly, ruining the rest of your shot. One of the ways this was fixed was by using real smears. The way that animators achieve this in stop motion is by printing multiple body parts, or printing one blurred one. Obviously, this is a lot easier today since we have 3D printing. Animators sometimes go even further by creating a whole character that's squished or stretched so it can be used for a certain clip. This squished character is only used for a few frames of the whole movie. Often, this is how animators achieve squash and stretch without making complicated armatures.
When I worked at Screen Novelties on the Elf special, we had the guy, he lands on the ground and he bounces, and they actually made a squashed version of him. So for one frame, I put that one in there where he's like all squashed down, and then I replaced it back with the regular puppet. And so that had squash and stretch, even though the puppet couldn't do it. You just build one in there.
This is usually saved for special scenes, since creating a whole new character for one part of the movie is time-consuming. CG doesn't have to deal with this issue at all, since you can directly edit the 3D shape itself. Editing the 3D shape is an important functionality for animators because it allows them to cheat the camera. Cheating the camera is essentially making the character stretch or move in weird ways so it looks good only to the camera. But when you're not looking at the character from the camera view, it looks really odd. You can also do this to a certain extent with stop motion animation, but it's a little less common.
I mean, there's definitely a lot of cheating that happens when you're going for a certain composition. There's plenty of times in puppet animation when, if you're only seeing the character like the torso up, you maybe just won't even have the legs attached. Or sometimes I find when I'm walking a character on screen, it looks fine because I'm animating to what I see on screen. But if you looked at it in reality, they might be like leaning sort of at a weird angle. Maybe they started normal, but after a few steps, they're kind of leaning at an awkward angle.
All of these tools are very helpful in showing character in stop motion. With that said, I want you to take a look at this. Did you notice the seam on Coraline's face? Where did it go in the final shot? First off, that seam is there because these faces are replacement faces. Each character can have thousands of these faces, and each one of those faces is designed by a CG artist for a specific shot in the movie. When these shapes are played back, they look animated. But back to the seam. Some studios, like Aardman Studios, use plasticine to cover up the seam. But Coraline used something else. They use CGI to cover the seam up. It's almost like CGI can't be escaped, especially today. Like, go ahead and take a look at this clip from Missing Link. Notice these characters on the side. They're not stop motion, they're CGI, created and animated on computers.
When you have a scene where there are crowds in the background, a mob of 50 or 100 people or something. It's just so impractical to make all of those puppets, practically and have an animator trying to animate, 50 puppets every frame. It just gets a little a little unruly for, the production schedule. That's where, it's kind of become pretty normal for background characters and crowds to be CG.
Thankfully, the main characters are still stop motion. CGI just helps immerse us more into these movies. Or at least that's what I tell myself. Stop motion animation has come a long way in the past 20 to 30 years, and it's because of the technological advancements and clever quote-unquote cheats that animators use. The actual puppets themselves didn't change too much. CGI and stop motion both grew alongside each other, and you can really see that in today's movies. Whether that's a bad thing or a good thing, I don't know. I personally like the older movies, but I understand why CGI is being used. By the way, I don't want to make it seem that CG is easy or bad in any sort of way. It's beautiful. And it can be just as difficult or even more difficult than stop motion at times. I'm just mainly showcasing stop motion. I want to thank our special guests today, Andy and Sarah, for helping me out with this video. You can check them out in the description below. With that being said, thank you for watching and bye.